It's time for another episode of Gospel Preaching Live, brought to you by the Kearney Church of Christ, which meets at 406 North Clark in Kearney, Missouri. Make plans to come out and visit the brethren, who look forward to seeing you. And now the host of Gospel Preaching Live, Richard Dodson.
Okay, welcome to another edition of Gospel Preaching Live. My name is Richard Dodson. I'm the minister of the Kearney Church of Christ. I'd like to invite you to watch this and other lessons on Kearney's Facebook or YouTube channels. And you can get there by going to www.kearneychurch.com and pressing on the Facebook or YouTube link. And you can watch those if you would like and leave comments in the comment section if you have any questions about that. And if you'd like to contact me directly, that's fine too. I'd love to hear from you. My email address is gospelpreachinglive@gmail.com. That's gospelpreachinglive@gmail.com. And my phone number is 816-686-9517. And that is in the Central Time Zone, 816-686-9517. Feel free to contact me and ask me any question or make any comment, and I'll try to get back with you on that. And if you like this lesson and other lessons that we have, share them. Now let's take the gospel to the whole world. Let's try to do that right online. So I'm glad to have you. I hope tonight's lesson will be beneficial, and let's go ahead and jump right into it. I'm going to ask you a question. Now, if you go to church, if you are a member of the Lord's body and you go to church each Sunday, what I want to know is, how do you go to church? Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, what do you mean? You want to know what mode of transportation? No, I don't. Well, do you want to know which route I take? No, I'm not looking for that either. What I'm looking for is, how do you go to church, as in, what type of attitude are you bringing to church? How do you come to church? That's what we're going to talk about this evening. You know, sometimes we can be in a bad environment. And when you're in a bad environment, that makes it very hard to accomplish whatever the task might be. And that's true with the church. Have you ever gone to someone and they greeted you with a warm smile, and they had that look in their eye like they were just really happy to see you, and that made you feel really good? Well, that's what Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 30 says. The light of the eyes rejoices the heart. And so we understand that our attitude can affect other people. And so it's very important that we prepare ourselves to come to the Lord's church. We have to have the right attitude, because if we don't have the right attitude, we can either spoil what has taken place there, or we can lend to a very bad atmosphere that is not conducive for the Lord's work. It won't be conducive to spiritual growth. And that's very important. We see a little bit of that in Galatians chapter 5. With the Galatians, they had been, as we've seen in Galatians 1, they had been listening to what they might have considered a different doctrine, but Paul was easily able to correct them and say there is no different doctrine, but they were listening to it, and he was upset about that. And he makes mention that a little leaven leavens the whole lump, and we understand what he's talking about. If you take yeast and mix it in dough, it doesn't take much before that yeast can just go through the whole lump of dough. Even though it's just a very small matter, it can leaven the whole lump of dough. Well, likewise, a bad attitude can leaven a whole church. In other words, it can spread throughout a church. And then likewise, a good attitude can do a big role also in changing the atmosphere of a church as well. But all those things happen with the individual, because no one makes decisions for us. We have to understand we make our own decisions. And so this lesson applies to the individual, because it's up to the individual to make that change. He has to do what he needs to do to play that part. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 15, he made mention of the fact that the Galatians atmosphere was not conducive to spiritual growth. He said, if you bite and devour one another, he said, watch out that you're not consumed by one another. And he goes on in verse 26 and corrects them about being conceited, provoking one another and envying one another. That's not a Christian atmosphere. And we need to make sure that when we go to church, we are lending a hand in creating an atmosphere that is conducive to spiritual growth. That's what we want to do. So, for the rest of this evening, we're going to look at the things that we need to have in order to come to church. How do you come to church? Well, first of all, you need to be prepared. That's our first point this evening. You need to be prepared. Now, we're going to look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 5 through 8, Matthew chapter 24, verse 42 through 44, and 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 5 through 8, Paul says, you are all children of light, children of the day. We are not of the night or of the darkness. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. Okay. Now, immediately someone might say, well, the Lord doesn't want us sleeping in. He doesn't. But that's not what this verse is about. But now I will take the liberty to state that we need to make sure we're rested the night before. We don't want to come to church all sleepy. If we're going to come, we want to be awake. We want to be sober-minded. We want to be aware of what's going on. But that's a physical state, and that can't always be that way. Some people work, at night, and they have no choice but to come to church tired. And, other people, something may be happening. They may be caring for the sick. There may be responsibilities that keep somebody, they just may not be able to get night's sleep for whatever reason. We don't know. But for the most part, for our practice, we need to try to have sleep. If it's available to us, we need to try to be rested instead of coming in and looking like we just jumped out of our pajamas. I mean, that's not a good thing. But that's not what this verse is meaning. What he is saying is we need to be sober-minded. We need to be aware of what's going on. Not sleeping as in not aware of what's taking place. Christians are in a game for their lives. This is a battle with the devil. And if we lose this, we're going to lose our souls for eternity. And so because of that, we realize the gravity of the situation. We are watchmen, as Ezekiel said. We are aware of what's taking place. We understand the seriousness of the situation because every time we assemble, it's a serious thing. There's responsibilities that need to be met. And so because of that, we're ready to go. We're prepared. We're not asleep. We're ready to do what we need to do to fulfill that task. In Matthew chapter 24 and verse 42 through 44, Jesus makes an interesting point. He says, therefore, stay awake, for you do not know what day your Lord is coming. In other words, if you're the watchman, as Ezekiel was, you need to be ready. You need to be doing your job because you don't know when the Lord's going to come again. So you need to stay awake. And he makes that point. Know this, if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Yes, we need to be ready. And with that, we need to know that we need to be doing our task. It's not something that when the Lord comes again, he finds us not doing it. Can you imagine not being at church when we could be at church at the time when Jesus returns? That would be a horrible thing. So we understand then that we have to be busy being a Christian and performing the Christian's tasks at all times, expecting the Lord to come at any moment because we just don't know. And so, even when we go to church, we have to have that same attitude, the attitude of, I have a job to do, I have to fulfill it. It's a purpose that you live by, not knowing when the master is coming back. First Peter chapter 3 makes it a kind of a different point, though, and I'm going to shift gears a little bit about this. But he said, sanctify the Lord God in your hearts and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason for the hope that's in you with meekness and fear. That's part about being prepared. When you come to church, are you ready to partake in the Bible classes? Are you ready to engage a visitor who may come to you with a question about what's taking place? Are you ready to engage a neighbor who may want to know why you go to church all the time? You know, all these things you need to be ready for. You need to be prepared. And so you need to, again, come to church ready to go, prepared to engage, to partake, and to be ready. You have to be always on your, always prepared when you're standing post. Can you imagine a guard standing his post and his gun not being loaded? No, he's got to be ready to fire it. Likewise, when we are doing our job as a Christian, we have to be prepared. All right, how about my second point? Joyous. We need to come to church and be happy about it. Joyous. I've seen some people come to church and they're like, oh boy, I can't believe I got to go to church. There are so many things I need to get done right now, but I got to come to church because all you guys expect me to come. Well, that's totally the wrong attitude. That's not what the Lord wants. And if that's your attitude about coming to church, you're missing the point. So let's consider that point. Let's look at Psalms 122 and verse 1, Isaiah 56 and verse 7, and then Psalm 42 and verse 4. But in Psalms 122 and verse 1, David said, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. You know, whenever you see that glad or happy or blessed is happy. That's the meaning of that. They're happy to go to the house of the Lord. And so if David was happy to go to the house of the Lord, why shouldn't we be happy about it? Thinking about what's going to take place. I can assure you that if everything is done scripturally, now I don't know, I can't speak for where you are, but I know at Kearney, we make great pains to make sure everything is done according to the scriptures, and we are prepared to give an answer to anyone who investigates us on that point. Now, with that, I know I can confidently say nothing bad is going to happen there at church. Anything that takes place is going to be good. And if anything that happens there is going to be good, why wouldn't you be glad about attending? Because only good things can happen. And here's the deal. When I'm talking about you, remember this. Only good things can happen to you going to church. Only good things. So you shouldn't worry if things are done scripturally. That only good things, and you will be benefited from it. So you should be happy to attend. In Isaiah 56 and verse 7, this is a passage that is looking forward. It's current. It applies to them currently, but it's looking forward. And I believe it's looking forward to the time when the Gentiles would be part of the Lord's church. At that time, you know, it was just the Israelites. But notice, I'll just pick up there in verse 7. He says, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. And so we can go to the Lord at church and knowing that prayers are being made. Now, is that a bad thing? Is it ever a bad thing to bring something to the Lord's attention when the whole congregation brings a matter to the Lord in prayer, that's a good thing. And we should be happy about that, knowing that we can take our brethren's problems, those problems that are announced at church, we can take those before the Lord and he have his attention. Psalms chapter 42 and verse 4 says, "These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude keeping festival." He would lead them in the procession to the house of God. Do you lead your family in the procession to the house of God? And are you all happy about it? You need to talk to your family about that, because if your children are grumbling about it, you need to find out why. What's the problem? And try to teach them, to correct them. Say the very things that we're saying today. Church is a place to be happy, and that needs to be the atmosphere. When visitors come in, they should see Christians who assemble there as happy people, happy to be there, that they couldn't think of any better place to be there than that time. Well, that's important, and that needs to be explained. How about humble? Do you come to church humble? You need to. That's something that's very, very important. Let's look at James chapter 4 and verse 7, then Matthew chapter 20, verse 25 through 28, and then Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3. In James 4 and verse 7, he says, "Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." Now, what's he saying? He says, obey God is what he's saying. Well, if you're obeying God, you're submitting to him. And if you're submitting to him, you are humbling yourself before him. You're not putting yourself at the same elevation as God. You are submitting. You are saying, you are my head. I am below you. It's my duty to obey. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people, when it's time to come to church, who's living a life, really, you could say they're too big for their britches, because they're trying to put themselves on par with God. God expects them to be at church. Their job is to say, yes, I will obey. Unfortunately, many of them don't obey. Why? Because they're not humbling themselves before God. We need to make sure that we have that attitude at church. People who are willing to obey God, to humble themselves before him. In Matthew chapter 20 and verse 25 through 28, Jesus says we're going to start talking about using that same humble attitude and applying that to our brethren. Jesus called to him and said, "You know the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Yes, Jesus gave us that example, how we are to serve others. And so we need to look upon our brethren, knowing and thinking that we serve them. And that's one reason why we go to church, as we'll talk about a little bit later. We're going to church. One of the reasons is to be a benefit to them spiritually. We want to encourage them to love and good works. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, Paul said, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves." You see, when we miss services because of doing something that we want to do over going to church, then what we're doing, we're displaying an attitude of selfishness. It's selfish ambition. You could even call it conceited, because you're not making yourself subject to the Lord. But we are to be thinking about our brethren, and we are to be thinking about what they need. And so if we're aware of our purpose to assemble with the church, to provoke others to obey God, to provoke others to love and good works, to be an example to our visitors and also those around us, our neighbors, then we humble ourselves and obey. And these things we have to do. We have to understand. We have to sacrifice our want tos as Jesus sacrificed himself as he walked this earth. Not only did he sacrifice himself on the cross, but he gave up heaven itself to come here and live as a poor man. Why? Because he was humbling himself so that it would benefit you and me. Well, with him being our master, with him being the teacher, and us being the disciple, we have to follow that example. We have to be willing to lower ourselves as well and start looking on how can we help our brethren. And of course, when we get to church, what do? We start asking our brethren, how's the week going for you? How are you doing? You show concern. And then you ask them, is there anything I can pray for? And if they have some things going on, you pray for them. That's all part of serving them. It's very, very important. And it will help make the atmosphere conducive to spiritual growth. Okay, so we talked about being prepared. We talked about being joyous and humble. What about kind-hearted? Being kind is so important. We're going to look at 1 Corinthians 13:4, then Ephesians 4 and verse 32, and then Colossians 3, verse 12 through 13. In 1 Corinthians 13:4, 1 Corinthians is basically right here defining what love is. And everyone likes to think that they love other people. But unfortunately, their actions don't seem to show it. But notice what he says. He says, love is patient and kind. And he goes on with other things about love. But it's patient and kind. In other words, when people come to services, they should expect you to be there and that you have established a practice of being kind. And they know if there's something troubling them, that you're going to be there to put your arm around them and say, look, I'm here with you on this. We're going to get through this. I'm right here. And you're going to pray with them. You're going to try to build them up through the word of God. You're going to try to build them up through songs, but you're going to be there to help them endure that temptation. You are right there with them. And that can be such a relief to a brother who's suffering. And that's being kind. And that's what we need to be. We need to be a kind people. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 32 says, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. Be kind. We need to believe in the best in each other. Jesus died in hope of seeing that. He really believed in the best of us. Well, we need to believe in the best of each other because, number one, Jesus believes in it. So if we look at our brother, no matter what's taking place in their life, we understand they can be everything that Jesus wants them to be. And it's our job to help them. Well, we're not going to be able to help them if we're mean to them. We need to be kind and let them see that we're here to serve them. Something that's very important. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12 through 13. Paul says, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness. And he goes on and talks about humility, meekness, and some other traits that we need to put on. But when I read that about putting on things, I think about like when we dress, you put on a shirt, you put on shoes. Well, do you put on kindness? These are spiritual clothing that the Lord's talking about. And we need to adorn ourselves in these things. We need to be a kind people, being compassionate, looking toward the needs of others, so that when others see us, they can trust us. They know that goodness is in our hearts and that we want them to succeed in getting to heaven. And our last point this evening is when we come to church, we need to be hungering and thirsting for righteousness. You know what righteousness means? It simply means being right with God. And we need to be hungering and thirsting for that because we need God. Without God in our life is a failure. It's doomed to failure. We have to have the Lord. Let's look at Matthew 5 and verse 6, Psalms 42, 1 through 2, and then Matthew 6 and verse 33. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Blessed are those, or happy are those, who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." You know, we usually eat, I don't know, every 6 hours, about you eat lunch at noon, you eat dinner around 6. When that time comes around, we start looking around thinking, okay, what are we going to eat? And it becomes a priority in our life. Okay, we got to get something to eat. Well, likewise, we need righteousness. But are you looking to fulfill that itch? Are you're hungering and thirsting for it, but are you looking to be satisfied? The same way we look to be satisfied when it's time to eat dinner. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be driving ourselves to be satisfied by looking for that righteousness. We need to hunger and thirst for it. Something that's very, very important. In Psalms 42 and verse 1 and 2 says, "As a deer pants for the flowing stream, so pants my soul for you. O God, my soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God?" I really like that line. My soul thirsts for God. Have you ever been really, really thirsty? I have. I can think of one specific time where I was very, very thirsty. And me and a brother that I was playing golf with, he was thirsty as well. And when we finished, it was our goal, it was our number one aim to get some fluids in us. And we went looking for water. We weren't going to stop until we found some. Well, likewise, we need to be thirsting for righteousness. And we have to have that attitude that we're not going to stop until we get it. We have to really, really seek after it. Matthew 6:33 says, "Seek first." That's important. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. In other words, Jesus always comes first. If you want righteousness, it's got to be first on your priority list. You got to be working at it. Jesus never comes second. Now, he has with people, but Jesus doesn't accept it. Jesus has to come first. So if you want those promises that are made in Matthew chapter 6, if you'd like to be a partaker of all those things, you're going to have to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Something's very important. All right. These are your points. How do you come to church? If you are coming prepared, if you're coming joyous and humble and kind-hearted, and you're hungry and thirsting for righteousness, you are doing your role. You are playing your part in creating a conducive atmosphere at church for spiritual growth. If you've not been doing that, you need to repent, because you're creating an atmosphere that's not good. This is what a Christian needs to do. This is what you need to bring to church, an attitude towards serving. And I pray that you're going to do just that very thing. I'll leave you with Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 24 and 25. I've preached these things tonight for your consideration, and that fulfills what's said in Hebrews 10:24. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. Well, that's what we just did. Not neglecting to meet together as the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Let us consider what we can do to make the church conducive to others and ourselves growing spiritually. Okay, that's all I got. I hope you liked it. If you're ever in the Kearney, Missouri area, we would love to meet with you. I tell you what, we meet at 9:30 Sunday morning, 10:30 for worship, and 9:30 is a Bible study. We are at 406 North Clark, and you can learn all about the church by going to www.kearneychurch.com. If you like this and other lessons like this, you can hear a lesson each Sunday morning on KPGZ 102.7 FM, Kearney's hometown radio station. It comes on every Sunday morning at 7 a.m. And if you're outside the Kearney area, it's no problem. You can stream it on your mobile device. Also, I'd like to invite you to take part in a Bible study that I'm part of with 3 other preachers. and it is called Berean Spirits. It airs every Thursday, and it goes live at 10 a.m., and you can take part in that by making comments on Facebook and YouTube. You can find access to this and past shows by going to kearneychurch.com and pressing on the Facebook, YouTube links, or the Berean Spirits YouTube link. And also keep in mind, they are now on Spotify or whatever platform. There's various platforms they're on. So you can download these Bible studies and take them with you, listen to them as you travel in your car. Okay, that's all I got for you this evening. Next time, Lord willing, I come to you will be this Thursday evening at 7 p.m. Until then, remember, this is the day the Lord has made. Let's rejoice in it and be glad.
This has been Gospel Preaching Live. Join us each week as truth is taught, faith is examined, and beliefs are challenged. Be sure and hit the like button so you can be notified of future episodes. And to watch past episodes, go to our website, kearneychurch.com. This has been a work of the Kearney Church of Christ.